The plantation lay far from any town road, hidden behind long stretches of pine and red clay that turned to mud whenever it rained. From a distance it looked almost peaceful. White columns holding up a wide veranda, fields moving gently with the wind, smoke rising calmly from the kitchen quarters each morning. To an outsider passing by, it might have appeared orderly, even prosperous. That illusion was carefully maintained, because order was the one thing the master valued above all else. Every bell rang on time, every task followed a rigid routine. Nothing in his mind was ever meant to surprise him. At the center of this routine were his children, 3 of them, young enough to still be seen as extensions of his legacy rather than burdens. They ran freely across the yard, their laughter carrying over the fields, their shoes rarely touching dirt for long before someone rushed to clean them. Their world was small but protected, wrapped in comfort and certainty. They had never known hunger, never known fear, never known what it meant to be powerless. To them, the plantation was not a place of suffering but a playground, and everyone on it existed to serve that purpose. Among those servants was the woman assigned to the children. She had no title beyond what was written in the ledger, a first name that was spoken only when necessary and a mark beside it indicating her age, her value, and her physical condition. She was not young but not yet old. Her back was straight, her movements careful and efficient, shaped by years of labor and punishment. She spoke rarely, not because she could not, but because she had learned that silence drew less attention. Silence, on a plantation like this, was often the closest thing to safety. Each morning she prepared the children's meals under the watchful eyes of the house staff. Cornbread, milk, sometimes meat, food richer than anything she herself would ever taste. She carried the plates carefully, never spilling, never hesitating. The children barely looked at her. To them, she was part of the background, like the furniture or the walls. They accepted the food without question, accepted her presence without acknowledgement. This invisibility was not accidental. It was the result of years of being trained to disappear. Beyond the main house, past the neatly kept yard, stood the pig pens. They were loud, muddy, and smelled of rot and waste. The pigs were valuable animals, raised for slaughter, fed on scraps and refuse from the plantation. The woman was often sent there after feeding the children, carrying buckets of leftovers, her shoes sinking into the filth as the animals rushed forward, squealing and fighting over every scrap. The work was unpleasant, but it was familiar. Familiarity, even with something degrading, could become a strange comfort. From the veranda, the master sometimes watched the scene unfold, the woman moving between the house and the pens, the children chasing each other nearby, the pigs crowding the fence. To him, it was a picture of efficiency. Each piece of his property served its purpose. The woman fed the children grew strong, the pigs fattened, nothing seemed out of place. What he did not see and never cared to see was the weight carried behind that woman's eyes. She had once lived on a different plantation years earlier before being sold south. She had once had children of her own. Their faces still lived somewhere in her memory, though time had blurred the details. She remembered their cries more clearly than their smiles, remembered the day they were taken from her, one by one, sold off like surplus goods. No one had asked her permission. No one had explained why. She had been told only to keep working, to be grateful she was still alive. Those memories did not fade simply because new routines were imposed on her. They surfaced in quiet moments. In the early morning before the bell rang, in the late evening when exhaustion made sleep difficult, and they surfaced most painfully when she was with the master's children, their small hands, their careless trust, the way they called out for food without fear of being denied. It all pressed against wounds that had never healed. She did not hate them in the simple way people imagine hatred. What she felt was heavier, more complex, tangled with grief, envy, and a sense of unbearable injustice. Still, on the surface she remained calm. The overseer noted her reliability. The mistress praised her obedience. No one suspected her of discontent, because discontent in their minds belonged only to the unruly and the defiant. She was neither. She followed orders. She lowered her eyes. She accepted punishment without protest when it came. That made her safe in their estimation, trustworthy enough to be placed near what they valued most. Days passed in repetition, morning meals, midday chores, evening scraps, the seasons shifted almost unnoticed. Summer heat pressed down on the fields, then slowly gave way to cooler air. The plantation changed very little, but inside the woman, something had begun to harden. The routines no longer numbed her thoughts as they once had. Instead, they sharpened them. Every step between the house and the pig pens traced the same path again and again until it felt carved into her mind. There were moments when she paused, standing still with a bucket in her hands, listening to the sounds around her, the children laughing, the pigs feeding, the distant crack of a whip somewhere in the fields. All of it blended into a single noise, a reminder of how this place functioned, how life and death, comfort and suffering were separated by nothing more than ownership. No one noticed these pauses, no one questioned her thoughts. The master believed he understood his world completely. He believed cruelty was a tool, not a danger. He believed that those he enslaved were incapable of planning, incapable of depth, incapable of crossing the invisible boundaries he had drawn around them. That belief allowed him to sleep easily at night. By the time the first signs of change appeared, it would already be too late to trace them back to these quiet days. Later, people would ask how something so terrible could have happened without warning. They would say there had been no signs, no threats, no rebellion. But the truth was that the signs had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, buried beneath routines so familiar they were never questioned. In 1853, on that isolated Georgia plantation, everything still appeared calm. The children were alive, the pigs were fed. The woman continued her work in silence, and the master, confident in his control, had no idea that the order he prized so deeply was already beginning to crack. Not from chaos, but from the slow, unseen consequences of a system built on cruelty and denial. Cruelty on the plantation was not always loud. More often, it settled into the body quietly, like a sickness that never fully revealed itself. For the enslaved woman, it had begun years before she ever stepped onto this Georgia land. She had been young when she first learned that her life was no longer her own, young enough to believe that obedience might one day be rewarded with mercy. That belief did not survive long. Eac. Passing year taught her the same lesson in different forms. Mercy was not part of the system, and hope was a dangerous thing to carry. Hunger was her first teacher, not the sudden hunger of a missed meal, but the constant, grinding emptiness that followed her through every task. She learned how to stretch scraps, how to ignore the sharp pains in her stomach, how to keep working even when her hands shook. Food was control on the plantation. It reminded her daily of where she stood in the order of things. She fed others better than she fed herself, watched children and animals consume what she was denied, and learned to swallow not just hunger but humiliation along with it. Violence came next, not always directed at her, but never far enough away to be ignored. The sound of punishment carried across the fields, a warning meant for everyone. She learned to flinch at raised voices, to tense at sudden movements. Even when the blows were not hers to receive, her body reacted as if they were. Fear became a reflex, woven into her muscles, her breathing, her sleep. At night, when exhaustion finally pulled her into rest, her dreams were filled with echoes of screams and the feeling of being chased by something she could never escape. Yet the deepest wound was not hunger or violence. It was loss. She had been a mother once, before anyone thought it necessary to ask what that meant to her. Her children had been born into bondage, but they had still been hers. She remembered holding them close, whispering songs she barely remembered herself, promising them safety she could not truly provide. For a brief time they had been the reason she endured everything else. Then one day they were gone. There was no single moment that defined that loss. It happened in pieces, a trader arriving, a conversation she was not allowed to join, a child pulled from her arms while she was told, "Oh, stand still, to be quiet, to be grateful she was not being sold with them." The memory of that day never left her. It lived in the way her chest tightened when she thought of small hands, in the way her throat closed when she heard children cry. She never knew where her children were taken. She never knew if they lived or died. That uncertainty became its own kind of torment, stretching endlessly into the future. Afterward, something inside her shifted. She continued to work, continued to obey, but the world lost its shape. Time blurred, days passed without meaning. The plantation she was later sold to became just another place of forced survival, another stretch of land where she was expected to forget what had been taken from her. She learned that forgetting was not possible. The mind could be broken, but it did not erase its own scars. On the Georgia plantation, her past followed her like a shadow. Being assigned to care for the master's children reopened wounds she had tried desperately to seal. Their presence was a constant reminder of what she had lost, but also of what had been denied to her children. She watched them eat full meals, watched them complain about trivial discomforts, watched them run freely without fear of being separated from their parents. Each small moment carried an unspoken comparison that pressed down on her chest. At first she tried to numb herself. She told herself the children were not her concern, that they were simply part of her assigned duties. She repeated the rules she had learned: do not think, do not feel, do not question. For a time, this worked. Habit can dull even the sharpest pain, but habit has limits. And as the years passed, the careful distance she tried to maintain began to collapse. The cruelty she endured was not only physical, it was psychological, systematic, and relentless. She was reminded daily that she was considered less than human. Decisions were made about her body, her labor, her future, without her consent or consideration. Even her grief was treated as an inconvenience. When she showed signs of sadness after losing her children, she was punished for distraction, told she was lazy, ungrateful, replaceable. The message was clear: her emotions did not matter. This constant denial of her humanity began to fracture her sense of self. She no longer trusted her own thoughts, no longer believed her pain deserved acknowledgement. Anger had nowhere to go, so it turned inward, mixing with shame and despair. Over time, that mixture hardened. It did not disappear, it transformed. She began to see the plantation not as a place of order, but as a machine designed to consume lives. Every part of it fed something else. The fields fed the market, the animals fed the household, the enslaved fed everyone, giving up their bodies, their time, their families. Even suffering seemed recycled, passed down from one generation to the next. Once she saw this, she could not unsee it. Her mind, stretched thin by years of trauma, began to disconnect in small ways. She found herself staring for long moments without realizing it. Sounds sometimes felt distant, as if coming from another world. Memories intruded without warning, overlapping with the present until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. These were not signs anyone recognized as danger. On a plantation, such behavior was dismissed as dullness or fatigue. There were moments when she felt something close to clarity, a sharp awareness that cut through the fog. In those moments, she understood that the cruelty inflicted on her was not accidental or temporary. It was the foundation of the system itself. That realization was both terrifying and destabilizing. If there was no justice, no relief, no future where things changed, then what did survival mean? The loss of her children became the center of that question. She imagined them growing up somewhere else, enduring the same hunger, the same fear, the same violence. She imagined them calling out for her in moments of pain. Those imagined cries followed her everywhere. They echoed in the laughter of the master's children, in the squeals of the pigs, in the quiet hours before dawn. The world around her seemed determined to remind her of what had been taken. Over time, grief twisted into something darker. It was no longer just sorrow, but a sense of unbearable imbalance. The idea that some lives were protected at all costs, while others were discarded, began to feel like an insult too large to ignore. She did not articulate this in words. She did not plan in the way free people imagine planning. Her mind worked differently now, shaped by trauma and confinement. Thoughts came in fragments, images, emotions, rather than logic. What outsiders would later call madness was, in truth, a mind pushed beyond its limits. She had been deprived of agency, dignity, and family, yet still expected to function as if none of that mattered. The plantation demanded obedience without offering stability or meaning in return. Something had to give, and slowly, quietly, something did. The cruelty that fractured her mind was not a single act, but a lifetime of erasure. Each ignored pain, each denied bond, each enforced silence added another crack. By the time she stood each day between the house and the pig pens, carrying out her duties with mechanical precision, her inner world was already collapsing. What remained was not simple hatred or revenge, but a distorted response to a reality that had stripped her of every normal outlet for grief and anger. In later years, people would struggle to understand how such a thing could happen. They would speak of evil, of monstrosity, of inexplicable behavior. What they would not speak of, or would choose not to see, was the environment that created it. The cruelty was not an exception to the system, it was the system, and the fractured mind that emerged from it was not a mystery, but a consequence long ignored. By the time this chapter of her life unfolded on that Georgia plantation, the woman she had once been was already gone. In her place stood someone shaped entirely by loss, control, and suffering, someone whose inner world had been warped beyond recognition. The plantation continued to function as it always had, blind to the damage it inflicted, unaware that the cruelty it normalized was quietly setting the stage for a tragedy it would later refuse to fully acknowledge. The morning began like countless others, with the sound of the bell cutting through the early air and pulling the plantation into motion. Mist still clung to the ground, softening the outlines of the fields and the trees beyond them. Inside the main house, servants moved quietly, preparing breakfast, lighting fires, arranging plates. The children were slower to wake, still wrapped in the comfort of sleep, unaware that this day would break the pattern their lives had followed so easily. The enslaved woman rose before dawn, as she always did. Her body followed routine without effort, muscles responding to memory rather than thought. She washed her hands in cold water, tied back her hair, and began preparing the morning meal. Cornmeal was mixed, milk poured, bread warmed. Nothing about her movements suggested hesitation or distraction. To anyone watching, she appeared exactly as she had the day before, and the day before that, calm, efficient, invisible. When the children finally emerged, rubbing their eyes and complaining softly about the early hour, she served them without meeting their gaze. The youngs? Tea lingered near her longer than usual, asking questions she barely heard. Children often spoke to her as if she were part of the room itself, expecting responses without waiting for them. She nodded when required, murmured when necessary, careful not to draw attention. When the plates were empty, she gathered them and stepped back, already thinking of the next task. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher, the children were allowed outside. They chased each other across the yard, their laughter echoing against the walls of the house. The mistress watched from the veranda for a time, satisfied that they were safe, then turned back to her own concerns. The overseer passed through, glancing briefly at the yard, counting heads out of habit more than care. 3 children ran in circles, kicking up dust. Everything seemed in order. The woman was instructed to take scraps to the pig pens. She lifted the bucket, its weight familiar in her hands, and walked the worn path away from the house. The pigs heard her coming and began to stir, their noises growing louder as she approached. This task, like all the others, was done without supervision. No one felt the need to watch her here. She had never given them a reason to doubt her. Time passed. The sun continued its slow movement across the sky. Somewhere a field hand called out, and the sound of work resumed its steady rhythm. Then, almost without warning, the quiet order of the morning fractured. The first cry came from the yard, a sharp panic call that cut through the usual noise. One of the older children stood frozen, eyes wide, shouting the youngest's name. At first, no one understood the urgency. Children wandered off all the time, exploring corners of the plantation they had been told not to enter. The mistress responded with irritation rather than fear, calling for calm, telling the child to stop shouting. But as minutes passed and the youngest did not reappear, concern began to spread. Servants were questioned. The yard was searched. The house was checked room by room. Someone suggested the child might have wandered toward the trees. Another insisted he had last been seen near the back of the house. Voices overlapped, confusion growing with every unanswered question. The master was summoned. His reaction was immediate and sharp. Orders were given. Men were sent in different directions, calling the child's name. The overseer organized a search, directing people toward the fields, the woods, the outbuildings. Dogs were considered, though none were immediately available. Panic began to take hold, not only because a child was missing, but because the disappearance threatened the master's sense of control. Throughout the chaos, the enslaved woman was barely noticed. She stood where she was told to stand, answered questions briefly when asked. Yes, she had fed the children. Yes, she had taken scraps to the pigs. No, she had not seen the child afterward. Her answers were simple, unremarkable, offering nothing to grasp onto. In a place where enslaved people were rarely believed to be capable of complex action, her words were accepted without scrutiny. As the search expanded, fear began to replace confusion. The idea that the child might be injured or lost somewhere beyond immediate reach unsettled everyone. The master's voice grew harsher. The mistress's composure cracked, her calm giving way to tears. Servants whispered among themselves, their faces tense, knowing that when masters were afraid, punishment often followed, regardless of guilt. The pig pens were searched briefly, more out of habit than suspicion. The area was unpleasant, muddy and chaotic, and no one wanted to linger there longer than necessary. A quick glance, a few shouted calls, and the search moved on. No one considered the pens a place where a child would go willingly. No one thought to look closely. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the plantation with unforgiving heat. Searchers returned empty-handed, reporting no sign of the child. The woods yielded nothing. The fields offered no clues. Frustration turned to anger. The master accused servants of carelessness, threatened punishment if the child was not found. Fear rippled through everyone present, a familiar dread that settled into the bones. As the day wore on, exhaustion set in. The mistress withdrew inside, overwhelmed by grief and anxiety. The search slowed, not because hope had faded, but because bodies could only move so long under the weight of fear and heat. Eventually, as evening approached, the master made a decision. The search would resume at dawn. For now, there was nothing more to be done. The plantation fell into an uneasy quiet. The absence of the youngest child was a physical presence, a gap that could not be ignored. Dinner was served in silence. Servants avoided eye contact. The master sat rigid, his thoughts fixed on possibilities he did not want to name. The enslaved woman completed her tasks as usual, her face unreadable, her movements steady. That night, sleep did not come easily to anyone. Lamps burned later than usual in the main house. Whispers carried through the quarters as enslaved people speculated in low voices about what might have happened. Some feared the child had been taken by an animal. Others feared something worse, though they did not say what that might be. Fear has a way of narrowing imagination, pushing thoughts toward the unthinkable without allowing them to fully form. By morning, the disappearance had transformed from an emergency into a mystery. The search resumed with renewed urgency, but the tone had shifted. Desperation replaced hope. Ever. Y corner of the plantation was examined again, more thoroughly this time. Outbuildings were emptied, pens were checked, wells were looked into. Still nothing. The master's anger grew more volatile. He demanded answers that no one could give. The overseer enforced harsher discipline, using fear to extract confessions that did not exist. Enslaved people were questioned repeatedly, their responses scrutinized for inconsistency. Yet the woman who had last been with the children remained largely untouched by suspicion. Her reputation for quiet obedience shielded her in a way no one consciously acknowledged. In the days that followed, the absence of the child became a wound that refused to close. The mistress moved through the house like a shadow of herself, clutching the child's belongings, searching for comfort in objects. The older children grew silent, their carefree laughter replaced by confusion and fear. They stayed closer to the house, watched more closely than before, sensing that the world had changed without understanding how or why. The enslaved woman continued her duties, now under the weight of attention that thickened the air around her. Every task felt heavier, every sound sharper. She noticed how eyes lingered longer than before, how conversations stopped when she entered a room. Though no accusation had been made, the plantation itself seemed to hold its breath. What no one yet realized was that this disappearance was not an isolated event, not an accident that could be explained and forgotten. It was the first visible crack in a system that relied on predictability and control. The master believed the problem was external, a child lost, a mistake made, a mystery to be solved. He did not consider that the threat might come from within the very structure he trusted. In the weeks to come, people would look back on this day and search for missed signs, moments when they might have acted differently. They would ask how a child could vanish without trace, how an entire plantation could fail to see what was happening in its midst. But on that first day, as night fell once more over the Georgia land, all they knew was that something precious was gone, and that the order they depended on had been quietly, irrevocably disturbed. In the days following the first disappearance, the plantation existed in a state of strained uncertainty. Life continued because it had to, fields still needed tending, meals still had to be prepared, but nothing felt the same. Conversations were shorter, voices lower. People moved with caution, as if the air itself might betray them. The absence of the child was no longer just a private grief within the master's house. It had become a presence felt across the entire property. Whispers began among the enslaved first, exchanged in quick glances and half-finished sentences. They spoke carefully, knowing that walls on plantations had ears. No one said the child's name aloud unless forced to. Instead, they referred to him indirectly, as if naming him might summon consequences. Fear was not new to them, but this was a different kind. Less immediate, more disorienting. It was the fear of the unknown, of a line being crossed that no one fully understood. The master responded to the unease with force. He increased patrols, demanded stricter oversight, and insisted that nothing be left unchecked. The overseer enforced these orders harshly, using discipline to remind everyone of their place. Yet despite the show of authority, control felt increasingly fragile. Each unanswered question chipped away at the certainty that had once defined the plantation's hierarchy. The mistress withdrew further into herself. She spent hours sitting in the child's room, touching his clothes, rearranging his toys, convincing hers, Elf, that he might still return. Her grief manifested in sudden outbursts, accusations flung at servants for imagined slights, tears that appeared without warning. Those closest to her learned to keep their distance, understanding that her sorrow made her unpredictable. The older children sensed the shift, even if they did not understand it. Their freedom was curtailed. They were kept indoors more often, watched closely whenever they ventured outside. The yard that had once echoed with carefree laughter grew quiet. Play became cautious, subdued, as if joy itself had become dangerous. They asked questions that no one could answer, and when those questions went unanswered, fear filled the gaps. It was during this period that people began to notice small, unsettling changes around the plantation. The pigs, always loud and aggressive, seemed more restless than usual. They fought harder over food, their noises carrying farther than before. At first, this was dismissed as nothing more than animals behaving as animals always did, but as days passed, the behavior did not subside. There was also a smell, faint at first, easy to ignore. Plantations were full of unpleasant odors, sweat, waste, rot. No one expected the air to be clean, yet this smell lingered in a way that made people pause, wrinkle their noses, glance toward the pig pens before continuing on their way. Some blamed spoiled feed. Others blamed the heat. No one voiced deeper suspicion because doing so would mean acknowledging something they were not prepared to confront. Whispers grew bolder as fear spread. Enslaved workers spoke among themselves late at night, sharing observations in hushed tones. Someone mentioned seeing the woman near the pig pens more often than usual. Another recalled that she had been the one to feed the children most days. These comments were not accusations, just fragments of unease floating in the dark. Still, once spoken, they could not be fully taken back. Among the white household staff, discomfort manifested differently. They did not whisper openly, but their eyes lingered longer, their movements more deliberate. Trust, once assumed, now required reassurance. The idea that something was wrong began to take shape, though no one dared define it. On a plantation built on rigid assumptions about power and obedience, the thought that those assumptions might be flawed was deeply unsettling. The master noticed the change in atmosphere and responded with anger rather than reflection. He insisted that rumors were distractions, that fear was weakening discipline. He dismissed concerns about the pigs, the smell, the strange tension, declaring them inconveniences exaggerated by idle minds. His authority, he believed, could silence doubt just as it silenced dissent. But authority could not erase what people sensed. The plantation felt watched, as if something unseen had embedded itself into daily life. Even the landscape seemed altered. The paths felt narrower. The buildings cast longer shadows. Sounds carried differently, sharper, more intrusive. At night, sleep came in fragments, interrupted by uneasy dreams and sudden waking. The enslaved woman at the center of these unspoken suspicions continued her work as before. She spoke no more than usual, revealed nothing in her expression. If she noticed the glances, the pauses in conversation, she gave no sign. Her routine remained intact, each task performed with mechanical precision. This consistency made her both invisible and unsettling. In a world suddenly filled with questions, she appeared unchanged. Some interpreted her calm as proof of innocence. Others found it troubling. Trauma often teaches people to hide, and on a plantation, survival depended on appearing unremarkable. Few understood how deeply that instinct could run. Fewer still considered what years of control and loss might produce when left unexamined. As the days stretched into weeks, the whispers intensified. People began to connect details they had previously ignored. The timing of the woman's movements, the proximity of the children to the pig pens, the fact that the area had not been thoroughly searched in the first frantic hours. Each realization fed the next, building a quiet, creeping dread. The smell grew harder to dismiss. It clung to the air near the pens, stronger on some days than others. Attempts were made to clean, to mask it, to explain it away. Lime was spread, waste was moved. Still, the unease persisted. What had once been background noise in plantation life now demanded attention. The master could no longer ignore the tension, even if he refused to acknowledge its source. He ordered another search, this time more thorough, more aggressive. Pens were inspected more closely, outbuildings were emptied, enslaved people were questioned again, their answers measured against one another for inconsistencies. Fear sharpened every interaction. Innocent mistakes were punished as potential evidence of guilt. Throughout this renewed scrutiny, the woman remained composed. Her answers did not change, her demeanor did not shift. To the master, this steadiness was reassuring. To others, it was unsettling. The plantation had entered a space where certainty no longer existed, where familiar roles no longer guaranteed safety. The whispers reached a breaking point when a second child disappeared. The discovery did not come all at once. It began with confusion, with a count that did not add up, with a name called that received no response. Panic returned, sharper and more desperate than before. The possibility that the first disappearance had been an accident evaporated instantly. Two missing chill. Dren could not be explained away. Fear surged through the plantation like a wave. The master's authority cracked under its weight. His anger turned frantic, his orders overlapping and contradictory. The mistress collapsed into grief, her sorrow now mixed with terror. The remaining child was pulled close, guarded constantly, as if proximity alone could prevent further loss. At this point, suspicion could no longer remain unspoken. Eyes turned openly toward the enslaved woman. Conversations halted when she entered a space. Guards watched her movements. The quiet trust she had once been afforded vanished overnight. Still, no one confronted her directly. Accusation required certainty, and certainty remained just out of reach. The plantation existed now in a state of collective dread. Every sound near the pig pens drew attention. Every shift in the air seemed significant. People wanted answers, but they also feared what those answers might reveal, not just about one woman, but about the system they lived within. Because if something unthinkable had happened, if the danger had come from a place assumed to be controlled and harmless, then the plantation was not the orderly world they believed it to be. It was something far more unstable, built on suffering so deep it had begun to warp reality itself. As night fell once more over the Georgia land, the whispers did not stop. They grew louder, more insistent, pressing against the edges of denial. Whatever the truth was, it was no longer content to remain hidden, and the plantation, trembling under the weight of its own silence, moved closer to a reckoning it could no longer avoid. The final search began without ceremony, driven not by hope but by dread. No one spoke of rescue anymore. The language had shifted subtly, almost unconsciously, from finding to confirming, from saving to ending uncertainty. The plantation felt sus, pended in time, every movement heavy, every sound too loud. Even the animals seemed restless, sensing the tension that clung to the air. The master ordered the pig pens examined again, this time without haste and without dismissal. Men approached the area with visible reluctance, covering their noses, stepping carefully through the mud. What had once been glanced at quickly was now inspected inch by inch. Fences were checked, troughs were overturned, the ground was disturbed where it had not been before. No one wanted to be the one to see too much, yet everyone knew that something waited there. As the inspection continued, silence replaced the frantic noise that had marked earlier searches. When voices did rise, they were low and strained. Someone stopped suddenly, gesturing for the others to come closer. What followed was not shouted, it did not need to be. Understanding passed from face to face without words, settling like a weight on the chest. The truth emerged slowly, unwillingly, as if the land itself resisted giving it up. What was found could not be mistaken, but it also could not be easily named. People struggled to reconcile what lay before them with the world they thought they understood. This was not an accident. This was not misfortune. It was something far worse, something that challenged the very assumptions that allowed the plantation to function. The master arrived soon after, his confidence already worn thin by days of fear. When he saw what the others had uncovered, his reaction was not the outrage one might expect, but shock edged with denial. He demanded explanations that no one could give. He searched faces for some other answer, some alternative meaning, anything that would allow him to turn away from the implications of what had happened. The mistress did not come to the pens. She did not need to. Word reached her quickly, carried by the looks on the faces of those who returned to the house. She collapsed into grief that bordered on hysteria, her cries echoing through rooms that had once been filled with children's voices. The household closed around her, shutting doors, drawing curtains, trying to contain a reality that refused to be contained. Attention turned inevitably to the enslaved woman. She was brought forward under guard, though she did not resist. Her face revealed little, not defiance or fear, but a kind of emptiness that unsettled those watching. Questions were asked sharply, repeatedly, as if volume alone might force clarity. She answered calmly, simply, offering no dramatic confession, no explanation that could make sense of what had been found. This lack of spectacle disturbed the master more than anger would have. He expected remorse, pleading, madness, something that fit into a familiar narrative of guilt. Instead, he was confronted with a quiet presence that refused to perform. The woman did not argue. She did not justify herself. She existed in that moment as she always had, controlled, contained, unreadable. Those present searched her face for signs of something they could label. Evil, insanity, anything that would place distance between her actions and the system that had shaped her life. It was easier to imagine a singular monster than to consider the cumulative effects of cruelty, loss, and dehumanization. Easier to believe this was an isolated horror than a consequence. The overseer urged swift action. There would be no trial, no formal inquiry. The law, such as it was, existed to protect property and order, not to examine uncomfortable truths. In that calculus, the children were mourned privately, while the enslaved woman was reduced once more to a problem to be removed. Justice, as defined on the plantation, was not about understanding, only about restoring control. What followed was carried out quickly and quietly. Those who participated did so with a sense of grim necessity, telling themselves they were ending a threat. No one spoke of her name, no one recorded her story. She was erased as thoroughly as the system allowed, her life concluded without ceremony or acknowledgement beyond what was required to reassure those in power. Official accounts, such as they existed, described the event in vague terms. An unfortunate incident, a disturbed servant, a tragedy beyond explanation. Details were softened, then omitted entirely. The pig pens were cleaned. The ground was turned. Life on the plantation was expected to resume, though nothing could truly return to what it had been. The master insisted on silence. He feared gossip more than grief, scandal more than sorrow. Visitors were told little. Neighbors heard rumors stripped of context and truth. The disappearance of the children became a whispered story rather than a documented one, its edges blurred by discomfort and denial. Among the enslaved, the reaction was different. They spoke of it quietly, cautiously, in fragments passed from one person to another, not as a sensational tale, but as a warning, a reflection of what prolonged suffering could do to a human mind. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, only a heavy recognition that the system they lived under devoured everyone it touched, though not equally. The plantation itself seemed altered afterward. The remaining child was never allowed to roam freely again. The mistress's grief hardened into bitterness. The master's authority became more rigid, more paranoid. Punishments increased, not because discipline had failed, but because fear demanded an outlet. At night the land felt different. People spoke of unease, of restless sleep, of a sense that something unresolved lingered in the air. Whether these feelings were guilt, fear, or simply the aftershock of trauma, no one could say. But the order the master valued so deeply had been permanently fractured. The discovery forced a truth into the open that could not be fully confronted. The plantation had created the conditions for its own horror. Years of cruelty, separation, and silence had shaped a reality that eventually broke through the surface. Killing the woman did not erase that fact. Burying the details did not undo it. In the end, the children were mourned as innocents, the woman remembered, if at all, as a villain. The larger story, the one that connected their fates, was left untold. History, written by those in power, chose simplicity over honesty, yet the land remembered. Long after the events of that year faded from official memory, people avoided the old pig pens. Stories persisted, stripped of names but heavy with meaning. They spoke not just of loss, but of a system that consumed lives and then pretended not to understand the consequences. What was discovered that day was not only a crime, but a mirror, one that reflected the brutal reality beneath the plantation's polished surface. And though the master and his world tried desperately to turn away, the image remained etched into the soil and into the silence that followed, refusing to be fully erased. After the woman was gone, the plantation tried to return to its routines, but the effort felt forced, almost theatrical. Bells rang at the usual hours, orders were given and followed. Fields were worked, meals prepared, accounts kept. On paper nothing had changed, yet beneath the surface everything was different. The disappearance of the woman did not restore order, it only exposed how fragile that order had always been. The master insisted on finality. He spoke of the matter as settled, something unfortunate but resolved. He forbade discussion of it, threatening punishment for anyone who repeated rumors or questioned his decisions. Silence, he believed, would seal the wound. But silence has a way of preserving pain rather than erasing it. The more he demanded that the past be forgotten, the more it lingered, unspoken but ever present. The mistress never fully recovered. Her grief did not soften with time, it hardened. She moved through the house like a stranger, avoiding rooms that once held laughter, clinging to rituals that brought no comfort. The loss of her children reshaped her entirely, yet even her suffering was constrained by the boundaries of her world. She mourned privately, but she did not question the system that had shaped the tragedy. To do so would have meant confronting truths she was neither taught nor encouraged to face. The remaining child grew up under constant watch. Freedom was replaced by vigilance. Innocence gave way to anxiety. Every step outside the house was monitored, every interaction measured. Childhood, once carefree, became cautious. The plantation that had once been a playground turned into a place of invisible dangers, its adults haunted by fear they could not articulate. Among the white household staff, trust never fully returned. They worked together out of necessity, but suspicion lingered beneath every exchange. The certainty that had once defined their hierarchy was gone. They had seen too clearly how quickly control could slip, how little protection their assumptions offered when confronted with reality. For the enslaved people, the aftermath carried a different weight. They understood erasure intimately. They had seen names vanish before, lives reduced to whispers and ledger marks. The woman's fate did not shock them so much as it confirmed what they already knew, that survival offered no guarantees, and that suffering unacknowledged could twist into something dangerous. They spoke. Of her rarely and cautiously, but when they did, their words carried nuance that official stories lacked. They did not describe her simply as evil or mad. They spoke of her as broken, as someone crushed beneath losses too great to carry. In their quiet retellings, the focus was not on what she did, but on what had been done to her long before. The plantation's reputation changed in subtle ways. Neighbors avoided certain topics. Visitors sensed an unease they could not name. Some claimed the land itself felt wrong, as if it resisted peace. These were dismissed as superstitions, but even those who scoffed at such ideas felt the shift. Prosperity never returned in the same way. Crops failed more often. Turnover increased. The master blamed chance, weather, fate, anything but himself. Records from that year were incomplete. Names were omitted. Details softened. Official accounts favored ambiguity over clarity. Histories written later referenced an incident without explanation. A footnote stripped of context. The enslaved woman's name, if it ever appeared, did not survive. Her story was not preserved by documents, but by memory. Fragmented, distorted, yet persistent. Over time, the pig pens fell into disuse. New ones were built farther away. The old area was avoided not by decree but by instinct. Even years later, people walked around it rather than through it. Children were warned away with vague explanations. No one wanted to articulate why. As decades passed and the plantation eventually changed hands, the story transformed. Details blurred, motives were debated. Some versions painted the woman as a monster. Others framed the event as an inexplicable anomaly. Rarely did anyone speak plainly about slavery itself, about the conditions that produced such despair. It was easier to isolate the horror than to confront the system that enabled it. Yet the land remembered what people tried to forget. Each generation inherited traces of the past. Uneasy feelings, half-told stories, places that felt wrong without explanation. The events of 1853 became part of the soil, part of the silence that settled over the property at night. In the broader sweep of history, the story was almost invisible. It did not change laws, it did not spark reform. It passed quietly into obscurity, overshadowed by larger events and louder tragedies. But invisibility does not equal insignificance. For those who lived it, and for those who carried its echoes, it shaped understanding in ways no record could capture. The woman's erasure was deliberate, but it was incomplete. Systems can destroy bodies and names, but they struggle to erase consequences. The cruelty that broke her did not disappear with her death. It continued, replicated in countless other lives, each one carrying its own potential for damage, its own unacknowledged grief. What remains most haunting is not the act itself, but the response to it. The speed with which responsibility was deflected, the eagerness to label and eliminate rather than examine and understand, the refusal to see enslaved people as fully human until their suffering disrupted the lives of those in power. In that sense, the plantation was never truly haunted by one woman or one tragedy. It was haunted by denial, by the insistence that order could be built on cruelty without consequence, by the belief that silence could substitute for justice. Long after the last structure fell and the land was reclaimed by time, the story endured in fragments. It surfaced in whispered warnings, in uneasy dreams, in the instinctive knowledge that some histories resist being buried. It reminded those who encountered it, directly or indirectly, that systems built on dehumanization do not simply harm their victims. They distort everyone they touch. The enslaved woman's life was erased from the record, but the truth of her existence remains woven into a larger history that cannot be fully sanitized. Her story stands as a grim testament to what prolonged cruelty can produce when grief is denied, humanity stripped away, and suffering forced into silence. In the end, the plantation did not just lose children. It lost its illusions. The belief that control equaled safety, that power ensured stability, that suffering could be managed without consequence, all of that collapsed. What remained was a cautionary legacy, one that speaks not only to the past, but to any system that mistakes domination for order, and though history may never record her name, the shadow she left behind continues to ask an uncomfortable question: how many tragedies are remembered as madness or evil when they are, in truth, the final expression of pain no one was willing to see?